Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 11 and compare it against the iPhone XR and see how both these phones basically hold up and compare in 2025. Now, the big thing to keep in mind here is that when it comes down to both these phones, they're both a little bit different, as you can probably imagine. They're both going to be these different types of devices, different types of panels, but they're both very similar as well because they both share a lot of similarity. So we'll take a look at both these throughout this whole entire video. First things first though, if you want to pick up either one of these types of phones though, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of both these phones. The iPhone XR, which came out back in 2018, on the front side is going to be giving you this 6.1-inch Liquid Retina IPS panel. So this type of panel was fairly controversial when it first came out, and that was always something that was super crazy going on here, because if you were to go through and pick up one of these types of devices, well, you were definitely going to be feeling like you were going to be getting somewhat of a different type of device when it came down to this one. So that was always something that was kind of crazy. With this panel though, like I said, there were already OLED phones that already had came out around this type of phone. So that was always something that was kind of interesting and a little bit different. But I will still tell you for the most part, if you were to go through and pick up one of these types of phones, you're definitely going to feel like the iPhone XR's panel really isn't that great anymore. And with the iPhone 11's panel, it was more or less the exact same thing. This phone was basically giving you a 6.1-inch Liquid Retina IPS panel inside of it. So it was essentially more or less the same type of layout. You were getting pretty big bezels on it, the notch up top as well. So it was, like I said, more or less kind of the same thing going on here, which may have not been that big of an issue, but I will tell you, when you're going to go through and pick up a phone, having an IPS panel nowadays is very, very outdated. OLED screens are way better. They give you way better just features and capability. Those ones make a lot more sense to go and buy rather than these ones. So I do feel like from that side, that is kind of one of those big things to keep in mind. They're both giving you 60 Hz displays as well. There's not really too many differences there, and they both pretty much get the same brightness. But I do feel like with an iPhone 11, maybe it's a little bit better, but it's really not that big of a deal. Both are giving you lightning ports at the bottom as well, which is always something really, really nice to have. I personally, like I said before, I love having lightning. But I love having USB Type-C more, but still I guess it gets the job done here. Curved sides on both, so that was always something that was interesting going on here. And you're also getting these glass backs. So these are standard glass backs, nothing super insane, some things we've already seen before. So that's always a nice thing to basically have here too. Dual camera setup on the back of the iPhone 11. We're getting a single camera setup on the iPhone XR, which was one of the more controversial aspects of that particular phone, if you all remember. And I will definitely tell you, looking on the exterior and looking on the outside, I would say both these phones look fairly similar, right? They're both giving you like kind of the same type of layout. Like there's not like anything like super insane or terrible going on here. But the big difference here is that the iPhone XR was giving you basically a single camera. The iPhone 11 was giving you that dual camera setup on the exterior. When it does come down to that price tag situation though, this is another one of those big key areas to kind of think about. If you're trying to go through and pick up a phone, the iPhone XR is pretty much still going to be a cheaper phone than the iPhone 11. So this is kind of what ends up happening if you're going to go through and pick up a device. That one is usually going to be the one that's going to be a little bit cheaper here for the most part because it is older. So that's why it just makes a little bit more sense maybe to go and pick up that type of device. But again, it's not like the biggest deal in the world, but that is going to be one of those key areas and key things that you might end up thinking about here when it comes down to that device. So if you're wanting the cheaper one, again, the iPhone XR is pretty much going to be the one there for you. Now, on top of that, when it comes down to that camera side, this was another one of those big things to keep in mind here too. So with the iPhone XR, this phone was giving you that single 12 megapixel camera on the backside. Still, it was like a pretty good camera, really nothing super terrible there. It was more or less what you'd expect. And as I said before, I do feel like if you're going to go through and pick up a phone, that type of camera was giving you like a pretty good layout for the most part. And I did actually really enjoy that a lot. With the iPhone 11, this one was a dual camera setup. So this one was basically giving you that 12 megapixel wide and ultra wide camera. And like I said before, if you're going to go through and pick up a phone, I do think that type of device and that type of panel was giving you a pretty good layout for the most part too. When it comes down to both though, I would probably tell you, in my personal opinion, the iPhone 11 was giving you a little bit of an edge. Even though they both were giving you portrait mode and those things, the iPhone 11 was giving you 4K at 60 frames per second on the front and the back side. The the iPhone XR was only giving you 4K at 60 on the back. So that in and of itself was another one of those big things to keep in mind there too. And I did feel like if you're going to go through and like use a phone like this, something like an iPhone 11 is giving you a little bit more of a future-proof phone. And considering they kept it at 4K at 60 on the front and the back for years and years after, it does make me feel a little bit better of owning something like an iPhone 11 over something like an iPhone XR. So not a big deal, but just one of those small things you might end up experiencing from that side too. On top of that, when it comes down to software longevity, the iPhone 11 is probably going to be the one that's probably going to last longer, but from what I'm seeing, from the reports that I'm seeing, it could also end up being that the iPhone XR could also end up being one of those phones that lasts just as long as the iPhone 11. How does that end up happening? Well, because the iPhone 11 is in this situation where that type of device is basically like, could end up ending off at iOS 18. Again, we don't really know for a fact. If that ends up even kind of remotely end up being the case, well, then you're going to have to remember that with something like the iPhone XR, if that actually were to happen, that phone would end up being the one that would last just as long as the iPhone XR. So that would actually be pretty insane. We're just going to have to wait and see what ends up happening here. But, if that ends up being the case, then both these phones would essentially end up lasting just as long with each other, when it comes down to it from that side. So that right there is another one of those really big things to keep in mind there when it comes down to it. Again, not the biggest deal in the world, but just one of those smaller things. And per Apple's website, they did actually state that the iPhone 11 was giving you better battery life than the iPhone XR. And I would still say that's probably the case. Like, you'll probably still end up getting better battery life inside of something like an iPhone XR. So that's always a good thing to better battery life on the iPhone 11. So that could be one key area to kind of think about there from that particular side as well. And finally, when it comes down to the performance, the iPhone XR was basically giving you this Apple A12 bionic chip inside of it with 3 gigs of RAM, where the iPhone 11 was giving you the Apple A13 bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigs of RAM. So if you're trying to go and get the phone that's going to be giving you an overall better experience, once again, there's a really high chance something like an iPhone 11 could end up being the one that's probably going to be giving you the better performance. In fact, the iPhone 11 was giving you the same amount of power, if not better power, inside of that phone than from something like the iPhone 11 Pro that this phone was originally kind of competing with. It was its, it was what this phone was based off of. So that was something that was very surprising to me. When you kind of think about it and you're going to go through and get these types of phones, it is kind of an interesting thing to kind of think about. So I've always thought about it that way. It's kind of insane. It's kind of cool. But that in and of itself, once again, is one of those small little things to kind of think about there from that particular side as well. So in my personal opinion, when I take a look at both these phones, I genuinely do think in pretty much every single way that a phone like an iPhone 11 or an iPhone XR, these phones are good, they still have a lot of capability and everything like that, and they're still great, but it does make a lot more sense to go and buy something like an iPhone, that's still supported with software and has a longer support ahead of it. That's why I kind of think a phone like an iPhone, 12 Pro, an iPhone 13 Pro, those types of phones, especially the 13s, those are the better ones I'd probably recommend buying here. Those are the ones I'd look at as probably being the overall better ones, and if I'm going to go through and pick up a device, that one probably makes a lot more sense for me to go and buy rather than something like an iPhone 11 or an iPhone XR. So in my personal opinion, that's kind of how I see it. Not the biggest deal in the world, but that's just kind of how I see these things. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.